Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive into student rentals. If you're thinking about renting to students and kind of want to know what you're getting into, this is the deep dive for you.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're entering this market at a time that a lot of people are describing as a slow period. With more properties available, it really becomes a renter's market, meaning negotiation is practically a given these days.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a psychological edge in a market that's currently favoring renters. Looking through these notes, one thing that jumps out is how focused they are on affordability, maybe even more so than some of the specific amenities a place might have.
Oh, absolutely. Students are often on pretty tight budgets, so they prioritize finding the most cost-effective housing options. And we actually see this reflected in your data, like that note where the students were choosing that less desirable main-level unit over that basement unit, even though the basement unit had better features, just because it was $250 cheaper per month.
Price just seemed to be the deciding factor.
It's a classic example of student-renter behavior, and it highlights one of the biggest challenges landlords face with students, those short-term leases. Students often only need housing for the academic year, which can lead to summer vacancies.
Yeah, that makes sense. But one landlord actually came up with a pretty neat solution for that. They offered a rent rebate at the end of the year if the student stayed for the full lease term.
Yeah, that's the credit strategy. It can be a win-win. The landlord secures that steady income, and the student essentially gets a discount for fulfilling the lease.
I like it. So this credit strategy sounds pretty intriguing. But let's say a tenant defaults on the lease. Does the landlord still have to honor that rebate?
Well, that's where the lease agreement comes in. You need to outline the conditions for the rebate really clearly to protect yourself as the landlord.
So it's not just a verbal agreement. It has to be specifically spelled out in writing.
Exactly. Documentation is key. The lease should say that the rebate depends on the tenant meeting all the terms of the lease. Things like paying rent on time and keeping the property in good condition.
Okay, so get it in writing. Now, what happens if a landlord is dealing with rent control? Does this credit strategy affect them when they want to increase the rent later on?
That's a great question. Rent control rules can be pretty different depending on where you are. So landlords need to be aware of the specific rules in their area.
Now let's move on to vetting tenants, especially international students. A lot of the landlords mentioned that traditional credit checks weren't always reliable in these cases.
Right. Those traditional checks might not work well for international students or those who rely a lot on support from their parents. So you got to be adaptable. Explore alternative ways to assess their financial stability.
Yeah, one landlord had a story about how hard it was to check an international student's finances. Language barriers and the fact that the student relied on their parents made it tricky.
Try video calls with family members. Use translation tools. Maybe ask for extra documents like bank statements or letters of financial guarantee.
So it's about going beyond the standard credit check, thinking outside the box. This also makes me think about communication. These students might not be familiar with the local rental custom.
Oh, absolutely. Clear communication from the beginning is so important. Explain your expectations, like lease terms, house rules, who's responsible for maintenance, and what happens if someone violates the rules. Don't assume they know.
Right. It's about setting the stage for a good landlord-tenant relationship, making sure everyone's on the same page from day one.
Exactly. It's all about transparency and proactive communication.
So it seems like being a successful landlord, especially with students, takes business savvy and legal awareness. You have to be strategic about your pricing and how you market your properties, careful about vetting tenants and keeping good records, and really proactive with communication and solving problems. Can you remind us what a guarantor is and why they're so common with student rentals?
Sure. A guarantor is basically someone who agrees to be responsible for the rent if the student can't pay. They're like a backup, giving the landlord some extra security. Guarantors are pretty common with students, especially international students or those who don't have much of a credit history yet. It helps protect the landlord's investment, but it's really important to vet both the student and the guarantor.
You're saying landlords shouldn't just accept any guarantor the student offers up. They need to do their homework.
Absolutely. Get their contact information, make sure they're financially stable, and spell out their responsibilities clearly in the lease. You need to be confident that they can and will actually pay up if the student doesn't.
Makes sense. Okay, let's talk about breaking a lease. We talked earlier about summer vacancies being a challenge with student rentals. Can students just break their lease because they're going home for a few months?
The RTA has very specific rules about when you can break a lease. Going home for the summer doesn't usually count.
So students can't just pack up and leave because school's out.
Right. They're bound by the terms of the lease, just like any other tenant. Of course, landlords can be flexible if they want to be, but they're not legally required to let a tenant break the lease without a good reason.
So what can landlords do to protect themselves from those mid-year vacancies? We talked about that rent rebate strategy as an incentive for students to stay, but are there other options?
There are a few things landlords can do. You can put clauses in the lease that specifically address ending the lease early. For example, you could require the student to find someone to take over the lease if they need to move out before it ends. Or you could specify a financial penalty if they break the lease without a good reason.
So it's all about setting clear expectations and having those backup plans in place. Even with the best lease agreement, things can still get complicated. What happens when it's not clear who's at fault or what the right thing to do is? How can landlords prepare for those tricky situations?
You're right. There will always be those gray areas, those situations where things get messy. That's where good documentation and communication really come in handy. Let me give you an example. Okay, so let's say a student moves out and there's some damage to the property. The student says it's just normal wear and tear, but the landlord thinks it's more than that. If the landlord had taken pictures or a video of the property before the student moved in, it would be much easier to figure out who's responsible for the damage.
That's a great point. It's like having that visual evidence to back up your claims. A picture really is worth 1,000 words sometimes.
Exactly. And it's not just about documenting the physical condition of the property. It's also about documenting your communication. Keep records of all your interactions with your tenants, whether it's emails, text messages, or even phone calls. If you ever have a dispute, that paper trail can be really valuable.
It's like creating a timeline of everything that happened so you can clearly see what was said and done. That could be so helpful for clearing up misunderstandings or even legal issues.
Absolutely. And remember, communication is key. If a problem comes up, address it right away with the student. Often a simple conversation can prevent small issues from becoming big problems.
It's like that saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Dealing with things head-on can save you a lot of trouble later. But what happens when communication doesn't work? Like when you have a tenant who's constantly late with rent, damaging the property, or just being disrespectful.
Constantly paying rent late, breaking the terms of the lease, or damaging the property can all be valid reasons for eviction. But it's important to remember that eviction is a legal process. You have to follow the proper procedures outlined in the RTA.
So you can't just kick someone out because they're annoying. There's a whole legal process you have to go through.
That's right. Like giving proper notice, filing the right paperwork with the authorities, and even going to a hearing if the tenant fights the eviction.
Sounds like a lot of work and honestly a bit intimidating.
It can be, especially for landlords who are new to this or not familiar with the legal side of things. But remember, knowledge is power. The more you know about the eviction process and your rights as a landlord, the better prepared you'll be.
So it's worth learning about the rules, even if you never have to actually evict someone.
Exactly. It's always better to be prepared. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll focus on the more practical aspects of managing student tenants. Things like building good relationships, communicating effectively, and creating a positive experience for everyone.
How can landlords actually make this whole renting to students thing run smoothly?
Well, one thing that I think often gets overlooked is that human element, Students, especially those new to renting, might just need a bit more guidance and support. Compared to your average tenant.
Yeah, it's like they're just coming out of those dorms and into this whole world of leases and landlords. So how can landlords actually do that? What are some practical tips for establishing that kind of rapport?
Well, first impressions are everything right. Give them a warm welcome. Walk them through the property, point out the important stuff, safety features, all that. And make those house rules crystal clear. That can really set the tone for a respectful and responsible tenancy. Those periodic check-ins, even if it's just a quick, how's everything going, can go a long way. It shows you care and encourages students to reciprocate that respect for you and the property.
It's about fostering that sense of community even in a rental situation. Okay, now let's talk about maintenance. Students aren't exactly known for being the handiest bunch. What's the best approach for landlords when it comes to repairs?
I think clarity and responsiveness are key. Spell out those maintenance responsibilities in the lease and address those repair requests promptly and professionally.
So it's about finding that balance between empowering them to handle those minor issues while also making sure those bigger problems get addressed quickly so they don't get worse.
Exactly. You don't want to be micromanaging, but you also need to protect your investment.
Now, what about those inevitable student moments? You know, those noise complaints, the late night parties, the overflowing garbage bins?
Well, remember those house rules we talked about? That's where they really come in. Be firm but fair. Address those issues directly and consistently. And don't be afraid to enforce those consequences when you need to.
So it's kind of like being that resident advisor, but with a little more authority?
You could say that. But a little empathy goes a long way, too. You know, remember, students are still learning. They're still getting used to living on their own. Sometimes a gentle reminder or a constructive conversation can be more effective than a lecture.
Right. It's about finding that balance between setting boundaries and understanding that everyone makes mistakes.
Exactly.
So we've talked about building rapport, clear communication, and even dealing with some of those growing pains that can come with student tenants. It sounds like managing student rentals is a bit of a juggling act. You need those skills, patience, and a willingness to adapt.
And a sense of humor. Don't forget to enjoy the ride. You know, students bring a certain energy and vibrancy to a property. You might not find that with other types of tenants.
That's a good point. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway for landlords who are thinking about renting to students?
Understand the market. Be crystal clear about your expectations. Build those positive relationships with your tenants. And embrace the challenges and rewards of this dynamic market.
It's like any relationship, really. It takes work communication and understanding to make it thrive.
We hope you feel a little more prepared to navigate this unique part of the rental market.
And remember, thorough research, clear communication, and a proactive approach can help create that win-win situation for both landlords and student tenants.
Until next time, happy renting.